do not have one plan, right? If you're gonna stack yourself on something, you should throw a couple of alternative scaffolds up beside you so that you have somewhere to go. You want to be a doctor? Okay, well, you could be a nurse. It's like it's not a doctor, but it beats cutting your throats. You're still doing 80% of what you wanted to do, and you want to think about this during your whole life, man. If you're gonna take a high risk, you want to scaffold yourself in another area so that if it fails, your button doesn't drop out and you die. And it's also very much worth thinking about what regards to setting up your life in general. It's like if you concentrate solely on your career, you can get a long way on your career. And I would say that that's a strategy that a minority of men do. That's all they do. They work for like 70 or 80 hours a week. They go flat out on their career. They're stacking everything on their small probability of exceptional status in a narrow domain, but it's hard on them. They do not have a life. It's very difficult for them to have a family. They do not know how to take any leisure activity like. They get very one dimension now. It may be that you need the emotionality is the price you have to pay to be exceptional at one thing. Because if you're going to be something like a genius level mathematician or scientist, say, it's like you're in a lab. You're in your lab all the time. You're working 70 hours a week or 80 hours a week. So you're smart. You're dedicated. You're unidimensional. And that's how you get to beat all the other people who are doing its only way. But the problem is you do not get a whole life now. If you love being a scientist and you have that focus of mind, well, first of all, you're a rare person. And second, you're gonna pay for it, but find more power than you do. But it is risky business to do that. You sacrifice a lot for it. And I would say most often, if you're speaking about having a healthy life, that isn't what you do. You spread yourself out more, so you have a family, you have some things that you do outside of work that are meaningful to you and useful. You have a network of friends. Well, 4 things alone are pretty to keep you well oriented. And then if one of those things collapses, everything doesn't go. Now, the price you pay for that is the more you strive to optimize the balance, the less likely you are to be financially and fantastically successful at any single one of them. But you might have a vary if you consider your life as a whole. That might be a winning strategy. One of the things that Carl Jung said, I really like this. He thought that men went after perfection and women went after wholeness. So perfection would be stacked all, no one thing, and luck for radical success. Not that all men do that, because they do not. But we're talking about the extremes, at least with regards to the men that do that. The wholeness idea is more like, well, it's like I want one thing in my life to be 150%. And I want 5 times in my life to be 80%. Well, there is a lot more richness in a life where you have 5 things operating at 80%. But you're not operating in any of them at 150. And I really believe this because I've watched men and women go through their careers now for long period of time. But one of the things that I've noticed that mostly women in their 30s bail out the unidimensional careers. They won't do them. They won't put in 80 hours a week that they would have to put in order to dominate the particular area. And it isn't the reason that they won't do. It's because they decide it's not worth it. And no wonder, because why would that be worth it? You have to ask yourself that. It's like, well, you want to be an outstanding scientist. It's like, okay, really, that's what you want, because that means that what you do, because you're competing with other people. They're smart, they're hardworking. If you want to be at the top, you have to be smarter and work harder than any of them. And working hard means working long hours. It also means working diligently. But in the final analysis, It's also an additive issue. If I'm smart and hardworking and I can crank out for 70 hours a week and you do it for 30 days, it's like in 2 years. I'm so far behind of you, you will never ever catch up. And I think probably maybe partially a reason too. The women aren't oriented that way more than men. I think there is 2 reasons. One is socioeconomic status doesn't make women more attractive on the mating markets, but it does make men more attractive. And the second is women's time frame is compressed. Because guys can always say, well, I'll have a kid later, and they can say that still they're like 80. Whereas women, it's like, no way, man. You gotta get it together by the time you are, let's say 40. But really, probably by 35, they definitely by 40, because otherwise it ain't happening. And that's bloodily dreadful. There is a sacrificial element in maturation, right? You have to sacrifice the poor potentiality of the childhood for the actuality of reframe. The question is, well, why would you do that? Well, one reason is it happens to you. Whether you do it or not, you can either choose your dream limitation or you can let it take you unaware when you're 30, or even worse, when you're 40. And then that's not a happy life. I see people like this, and I think it's more and more common in our culture because people can put off maturity without suffering an immediate penalty. But all that happens in a penalty accrues. And when it finally hits, it just walls you. Because when you're 25, you can be an idiot. It's no problem even when you're out in a job search. It's like, well, you don't have any experience and you're clueless. It's, yeah, you're young, it's no problem. That's wrong, young people are like. But they're full of potential, okay? Well, now you're the same person at the 30. It's like the people aren't so thrilled about their point. It's like, what the hell have been doing for the last 30 years? Well, I'm just clueless as I was when I was 22. Yeah, but you're not anymore 22. You are an old infant, right? And that's an ugly thing, an old infant. So part of the reason you choose your dream sacrifice, because the sacrifice is inevitable, but at least you get to choose it. And then there is something that's even more complex than that. In some sense, is that the problem with being a child is that all your potential, and it's really low resolution. You could be anything, and you're not anything, and then you go and adopt an apprenticeship, roughly speaking, and then you become, at least you become something. And when you're something, that makes a world open up to you again. If you're really good plumber, and you can end up being far more than a plumber, if you're really good plumber, well, then you have some employees, you run a business, you train some other people, you enlarge their lives, you're a pillar of the community. You have your family. It's once you pass through that narrow training periods, which narrows you and constrains you and develop you at the same time. Then you can come out and others with a branch of new possibility of half. Part of a proper path of development in the last half of life was to rediscover the child that you left behind as you were apprenticing. And so that you get to be something and regain that potential at the same time. You're in a situation that you're in right now, and that's not good enough. And so that another thing that's interesting about people is they're chronically dissatisfied with way the things are. Well, that's okay, because you wouldn't be motivated to move forward if you weren't chronically dissatisfied with the way the things are. But it's annoying because you might think, why aren't you just happy with what you have? And the answer to that is generally because I don't know if it's gonna fast and last. And so that's part of it. And the other is, well, if the solution shifted a bit, maybe I would have more options. And some of that would be I would last longer. It would be more stable. It would be more promising. And so you can say, well, you should be satisfied with what you have. But it is really a stupid thing in some sense to tell human beings. Because no matter what you have, it's not going to solve your fundamental problem. So the problem isn't going away. And you cannot just fool yourself into saying, well, what I have is great. You could say, I could have a hell of lot less. And that would be bad. And most people have lot less than me. And it should be grateful for what I have. That's fine. That's perfectly reasonable. But you're struck with a chronic sense of unfinished business. And the reason for that, well, you're permanently vulnerable. So how could it be otherwise? And even if you've got your problem solved, then there is 3 or 4 people in your family that by no means have got their problem solved. So the problem of problems never goes away. That's a good thing to know existentially too, because it helps you calibrate your life properly. Because you might be thinking, well, if I just got everything together, I would hit some plateau of stability, and then I would just be there. It's like, no, that's never going to happen. It's never gonna happen. So you might as well just forget about that. Well, maybe you're not gonna push you damn right uphill. It's gonna rock down again. It's like, what are you going to do? Just sit there by the rock. It's okay to be active even if the problem you're trying to solve is not fundamentally available. That doesn't mean it isn't worth trying to solve. You guys should listen to this because I know what I'm talking about. If you happen to be creative, if you're a songwriter or another musician or an artist or any of the other number of things that you might be, find a way to make money and then practice your craft on the side, because you will strive at death otherwise. Now, for some of you, you won't be true, but it's tiny minority. Your best bet is to find a job that will keep body and soul together and pass up some time that you can pursue your creative things, because then, well, as a long-term strategy, medium to long-term strategy, it's a better one. You hear very frequently strategy, and people say things like everyone's creative. It's like that wrong. It is wrong. It's just as wrong as saying that everyone's extrovert. First of all, you have to be pretty damn smart to be creative, because otherwise you're just gonna get to where other people have already got. And that's not creative by definition. And then you also have these divergent thinking capabilities. And that's part of your trait structure. And creative people are really different than non-creative people. Partially because, for example, they're highly motivated to do creative things, and to partially because experience novelty and to chase down experience, to attend movies and to read fiction and to go to museums and to enjoy poverty and to enjoy music that's not conventional music, for example. These aren't trivial differences. And so it's a real mistake to make a position that everyone's creative. It's just simply not the case. It's a matter of wishful thinking. It's like saying that everyone's intelligent. It's like, well, if is everyone's intelligence, then the term loses all its meaning, because any term that you can apply to everyone member of category, it has absolutely no meaning. The other thing you want to be thinking about here is that do not be thinking that creativity is such a good thing. It's a high risk, high return strategy. There is creative people in this room, man. You guys are gonna have a hell of time monetizing your creativity. It's virtually impossible. It's really difficult, because first of all, let's say you make an original product. You think the world will beat a pathway to your door if you build a better master tip. It's like the complete rubbish. It isn't true in the last. If you make a good creative product, you probably solve about 5% of your problem, because then you have marketing, which is insanely difficult. And then you have sales, and then you have customer support, and then you have to build an organization. if it's really novel, you have to tell people what the hell is. We built this future authoring program. It's available for people online. How do you market that? No one knows the problem that another million people have also written a book. But if you produce something that's completely new and doesn't have a category, people cannot search for it online. How are they going to find it? And then you have pricing problem. It's really unbelievably difficult to produce something creative and then monetize it. And even worse, if you're a creative person, let's say you have a spectacular, you've got no money, you've got no customers. Those are big problems. And so maybe you go and find a venture capitalist. You start with the problems. And family friend, because that's how it works. You raise money for your product, you raise money for your family and friends. This assuming you have family and friends that have some money, and they are going to give it to you. And most people aren't in that situation, so it's terrible barrier right off the bat. And then of course you're putting your family and friends at substantial financial risk, because the probability that your stupid idea is going to make money is virtually zero, even if it's really brilliant idea. And so then, let's say, well, you get past family and friends and you get venture capital, catalyst involved, because that's often the next step, or an angel investor. There is a step in building a business, family and friends, angel investor, that some rich guy that you happen to meet, some man or in some ways who is into the thing that is willing to provide you with some money to get your product off the ground. Well, how much of your product is that person going to take? Well, most of it. And no wonder, because you do not have any money. How are you going to bargain for control over your product? He will just say, well, do you want the money or not? And if your answer is no, then he will go and do something else with his money. It's not like there is no shortage of things that you can do with your money. There is a million things you venture capitalists involved. They'll take another big chunk. And maybe if they're not very strained against you, they will just throw you out, because maybe that point in the company's development, you're not but a pain in the neck. Because what do you know about marketing and sales and customer service and building an organization and running a business? You do not have a clue, so why do they need you? So even if you're successful at generating a new idea and you put it into a business, the probability that you as an organizer of the data, an idea, are going to make some money from it is very, very slow. So don't be thinking that creativity is something you would want to curse yourself with. Now, it's not all bad, because it opens up avenues of experience and creative people that aren't available to people who aren't creative, but it's definitely in a high risk, high return strategy. So the overwhelming probability is that you will fail, but a small proportion of the creative people succeed spectacularly. And so it's like a lottery in some sense. You're probably going to lose, but if you do not lose, you could win big. And that keeps a lot of creative people going. But also they won't and don't really have much choice in it. Because if you're a creative person, you're like a fruit tree that's bearing fruits. So don't really have. You can surpass it, but it's very bad for you. The creative people I've worked with, if they're not creative, they're miserable. So they have to do it. And there is a real joy and pleasure in it, and psychological utility, but doesn't necessarily mean that this is intelligent. It's certainly not a conservative strategy for moving forward through life. What does it mean to think creatively? It's something like this. You imagine this. I toss you out an idea, and there is some probability that when I toss you that idea, that will trigger off other ideas in your imagination. So you could think about it as a threshold issue. If you're not very creative, I'll throw you an idea and hardly any other idea will be triggered. and the ones that will be triggered are going to be very closely associated with what initial idea. So let's say I tossed each of you an idea, and I asked you to tell me the first thing that comes to your mind. Okay, what we would see first is that the first thing that comes to mind, in all likelihood, would be shared by many of us. Okay, so you could think about a common response, right? And so the else creative response, and then there are all some things that come to your mind for you is that you are only person that thinks about it, and no one can understand it well. That's also exactly creative, because the thing that you, for example, to be creative, it has to be novel and useful at the same time. That's a rough definition, because creative is novel and useful. So anyway you can think of it, you get thrown to idea that are some probability that will co-activate other ideas. It's co-activate. If it co-activates many others ideas, that's like fluency. If it co-activates ideas that are quite distance from the original idea, something like that, and you could track distance by comparing it to probability that other people have generated, then you also another indication of creativity. There have to be many unlikely responses that are useful. That's what creativity is. Roughly speaking, then, you can fractionate it into different dimensions. So that's creative thinking, but your creative achievement would be the ability to take those original ideas then actually to be implemented them in a very world. And that's obviously much more different than merely being creative.